Hey, what's up guys? Alex here with a new video, and today we are doing a comparison between the brand new Nikon 50mm f1.4 and the not so new Nikon 50mm f1.8. Now, I don't have the 1.8 on me anymore because I rented it for this comparison, but I actually purchased the 1.4, and you will see why at the end of this video. If you're new to the channel, I actually also did a review and comparison between the 35 1.4 and the 35 1.8, and I will link it somewhere up here so you can check it out because you're going to see there's a lot of similarities between these two lenses. For this comparison, we're going to look at a few things: build quality and price, and of course, image quality. Like I do with all my videos, I will be providing the images we show you in the image quality comparison for you to download so you can check them out yourself and pixel peep as much as you want. With that being said, let's kick things off and talk about build quality. So the 50mm f1.4 is a new lens and part of a new lineup because Nikon released a 35mm f1.4 a few months ago. This lens is made out of plastic. It has a big focusing ring. It has a customizable ring, which is new to the system here for these lenses, and it has no switches or dials. The 50mm f1.8s is quite different. It's made out of metal and plastic. It has an autofocus manual focus switch, and it does not have a customizable ring. Both lenses are actually the same size. It's weird because one of these lenses is a 1.4, and traditionally 1.4 lenses are bigger, but in this case, they actually are the same size and close to the same weight. The biggest difference here is the price point, but even then, it's not that big of a difference. The 50mm f1.4 retails for $496, and right now the 1.8 retails for $626, which is about $130 more, but that lens is usually on sale, so the price can actually be even closer if you get the 1.8 on sale. As far as build quality goes, you really can't go wrong with either or. They both feel great. They both actually look great. I personally like the clean design of the 1.4 and the customizable ring, but all of this is preference and they both have incredible build quality and will live up to the Nikon standard. But what about image quality? Here's the part that the lenses will truly take two different paths, and I genuinely feel you're either going to love the 51.4 or you're going to hate the 51.4, and let's find out which camp you're in. Let's go ahead and go straight into the pixel peeping session and do an image quality comparison.
Let's kick off this comparison, but before we start, let's set out some rules. On the left-hand side, we will always have the 51.4, and on the right-hand side, it will always be the 51.8. All these images were shot with a tripod with my Nikon ZF, and we are looking at raw files. They all have the same white balance and the same color profile, which is the Nikon portrait profile. One thing to note, with Nikon files, for some weird reason, Lightroom applies a crazy amount of denoising when you import the files. So I also removed all denoising from Lightroom in these images, and I highly suggest you look at that when you import your Nikon files because it impacts sharpness in your images. With that said, we can now kick off. And on the left-hand side, we have the 1.4 wide open. On the right-hand side, we have the 1.8 wide open. And you're going to notice off the bat, the 1.8 is more contrasty. Zooming in, you're going to see that the 1.8 is sharp. This lens has a reputation for being one of Nikon's best 1.8 primes, and I can see why. The detail it renders is just insane, and you can count the skin pores, you can count the hairs, and again, this is the Nikon ZF, so this is 24 megapixels. On the left-hand side, the 1.4 actually renders just like the 35 1.4. It has a soft glow wide open. It's not crazy sharp, it's sharp enough. It's not rendering all the skin imperfections and the contrast like the 1.8 does. And for portraits, this could be a good thing. It really depends on what you're trying to do because you can have a base like the 1.8 and then just apply different kind of color corrections and soften the image. You can use a filter. You can always take away sharpness. You can't add sharpness. So it really depends. Also, if you look here on the shoulder, I'm not sure you're going to see this on YouTube, but the 1.4 is already showing some green fringing versus the 1.8 is kind of optically perfect. Zooming out, you can see that the 1.4 does have more background blur, but here's the kicker. The background blur on the 1.4, you're either going to hate it or love it because it's just like the 35mm. What I mean by that is the background blur on the 1.4s really embody a vintage lens. And what I mean by that is you have that harsh soap bubble bokeh. It's not smooth like modern lenses. It looks like an old vintage lens, and either you love it or you hate it. Personally, I'm a fan because it makes the image look different, but I know some people aren't gonna like it. Zooming out, even when you're looking at the image one-to-one, you're gonna see that that background blur and that background look is unique and distinctive, and if you don't like it, this 1.4 is not for you. So we looked at the sharpness wide open. What if we stop down the 1.4 to 1.8? Does it get closer to the 1.8 as prime? Let's find out. So here we have both images at 1.8. If we zoom in, you're going to see that the 1.4 does sharpen up a little bit, but the 1.8 is still outperforming it wide open. If you look at the background blur, the 1.4 still has the distinct look. You do get a little bit more sharpness, but nothing really changes. But what if we stop both images down to 2.8? Let's take a look at that. Both stop down at 2.8. If we zoom in, you're going to see that the 1.4 definitely sharpens up, and now it's competing pretty close to the 1.8. As a matter of fact, the 1.8 is still a little bit sharper, but not by much, and now they're starting to render very similarly. If we zoom out, you're also going to notice in the background blur, the 1.8 is still a little bit smoother, but you start losing some of those characteristics on the 1.4. I mean, you see the green fringing here, but as far as the softness of the bokeh, they start getting a lot more similar than they are different. And that's why with these lenses, you really want to compare them shot wide open, because as you stop them down, almost all lenses will sharpen up and almost all lenses will start looking very similar. So I didn't do an f4.0 test, but I bet you if we shot them at f4, it would probably look identical. So the differences are really going to be in the 1.4 to 1.8 and the 1.8 to 1.8. But let's look at another set of images. Okay, in this set, if we zoom in, we're going to be able to see here that the 1.8 is sharper. It's rendering more detail. The 1.4 is softer. It does have a glow to it. The background blur is very distinct, and I feel like this is more distinct on the 50 than it is on the 35, and I can already see it in the comments. Either you're going to love this or you're going to hate it, but there's going to be no in the middle. I just don't see it happening. But as far as detail and sharpness goes, the 1.4 is sharp enough. I keep saying that because for portraits, this will definitely be sharp enough. The 1.8 is probably as close to perfect as you can get here in the Nikon lineup. And zooming out, you're going to see that the rendering is nice on both images. Let's take a look at both of these at 2.8. At 2.8, the images start looking roughly the same. If you zoom in, like I mentioned, the 1.4 sharpens up, and the background blur also starts looking similar. Now, the 1.4 still has the green fringing, and there's still some of those characteristics, but the images now start looking closer together than they do wide open. And zooming out, again, they both render really beautiful images. Let's take a look at a few more photos. All right, for this next set of images, we're wide open on both, and if we zoom in, same story. The 1.8 is a sharper lens, but another thing to point out here, if you look at the 1.8 on the right-hand side, you're going to see that even the earring is still rendering tons of detail because of its 1.8 nature. At 1.4, the fall-off just starts happening so much more faster, where even the earring now is starting to get blurred out significantly, and that's the difference of 1.8 to 1.4. Again, though, the 1.4 is sharp enough, and it's not as bitingly sharp as the 1.8 is here on the right-hand side. The background blur, again, harsher edges, that unique rendering, green fringing. That's what you're signing up for if you get the 51.4. A softer image, a glow wide open, and vintage rendering, vintage background characteristics. I think I have two more sets of images I want to show you, and then we can wrap up our conclusions. So for this set, both images are shot wide open, and if we zoom in, we're going to see the exact same story. The 1.8 is a crazy sharp lens. It renders more detail. And this is a 24 megapixel sensor, which means if you're shooting with a Z8, a Z9, or a higher megapixel sensor, this 1.8 lens will continue to just resolve intense amount of detail. If you look at some of the background here, you're going to see that the 1.8 hardly shows any purple fringing versus the 1.4 has quite a bit here in the background. Zooming out, again, if you look at them from this perspective, if you're not pixel peeping, both images are just fine, and there really is nothing to talk about. But we're photographers. This is what we do. We zoom in and pixel peep. I have one more set of images I want to share, and then we can wrap up our thoughts. So looking at this last set of images, This last set surprised me and didn't at the same time. What do I mean by that? Well, the 1.8 has better lens coatings, which means it should do better with lens flares and like the green and purple fringing. And we're going to see that it actually does. But as far as contrast, the 1.4 actually did a better job here. And I'm not sure why, because everything else it kind of failed pretty miserably at. So as you can see, the sun is back here and it's pointing straight at the lens, which means this is a very challenging situation. And you're going to see that the 1.8 definitely has a haze to it because the sun is pointing straight at the lens, but the 1.4 somehow still retained contrast. If we zoom in, you're going to see that the 1.4 just has tons of green fringing in the back. The 1.8 doesn't. If you look at the subject here, even though the 1.8 does have a haze to it, it's still a sharp image. But the 1.4 here, I think from a contrast perspective, did a better job. You will also notice that the 1.4 has a green flare here below the face. The 1.8 has a rainbow flare here above the eye. And if we look at the bottom, we're going to see that the 1.4 has a pronounced green flare here at the bottom. And the 1.8 has a very subtle rainbow flare at the bottom. Again, nothing crazy, but I wanted to show you how these lenses performed with the sun pointing straight at them. I think we've seen enough images, we've seen enough to get an idea of how these lenses render. Let's go ahead and wrap up our thoughts.
So there you have it. What did you guys think? Before I say anything else, let me know down in the comments below. I gotta start off by saying this. The 51.8 lived up to the hype. This lens is sharp. It's almost optically perfect, and I can see why it's one of Nikon's best lenses in the market. It's also small, lightweight, compact. You cannot go wrong with this lens. The 51.4 also delivers on its promise that the 35 1.4 did. And I'm calling this vintage characteristics with modern optics. What I mean by that is you get that vintage background, you get that soft glow wide open, you get those imperfections, but you still get a decently sharp lens. If you were to buy a vintage lens, of course you'd get those vintage characteristics. Now you probably wouldn't get autofocus, and you wouldn't get this level of sharpness. So this kind of blends both worlds, and this is why I love this new 1.4 lineup, but also why I know it's going to divide so many people. I think the reality is, in this era we live in as photographers, almost every single lens is perfect. Lenses are getting so sharp, they're getting so good, that every single lens is starting to look the same, starting to render the same, and you're kind of losing that character. I also understand that some photographers don't care about character and they demand that perfection. And if you're that photographer, look, the choice is simple, get the 1.8. But if you're a photographer who has that wiggle room and flexibility to add some character to your images, to add a little bit of oomph and something different to stand out from the crowd, this 1.4 lineup is phenomenal. And I love that Nikon is doing this. I love the 35 1.4. I still got to use the 51.4 a lot more to really review it, but just based on the rendering and characteristics and the fact that you can tell it's part of a family of lenses, I know I'm going to love it because the 50mm focal length is my favorite focal length. But it's up to you to decide what you buy. And I think here the choice is simple. Perfection or a character lens. There's no wrong. They're both great options. You just got to choose what you need for your job, what you need for your images, and the look you prefer. So guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you download the images so you can check them out yourself and pixel peep and you can come up with your own conclusions. And as always guys, please smash the like button. It really helps the channel. Please smash the subscribe button. It also really helps the channel. And I will see you on the next one. Have a good one guys. Peace.